During the muggy Midwest summers, there is no better relief than taking the family to the local pool. For families in Indianapolis's Butler-Tarkington neighborhood, one of the biggest swimming destinations is the Riviera Club, a private club well known for its impressive aquatic facilities. While the club was especially popular for kids in the area, not everyone in Butler-Tarkington was always allowed to swim. My dad, Reuben, grew up in a proud Jewish family, living in the Butler-Tarkington neighborhood during the 50s. The Reuben family included his two older siblings, David and Elaine, and his parents, Albert and Sarah. Sarah often spoke about having immigrated to the United States from Belarus, fleeing the ethnic cleansing of Jews when she was only 9 years old. While raising her 3 children, Sarah was a member and president of the local Hadassah chapter, an active participant in Beth El Zedek's sisterhood, and volunteered for various social services, notably assisting Jewish Russian immigrants with their transition to Indianapolis. Albert's drive made him into a successful commercial real estate developer, which in turn gave him opportunities to act as a community advocate. Despite the anti-Semitism in the years following the Second World War, the Reubens held tight to their Jewish values, carving out a happy life in Indianapolis. It was this resilience and their steadfast faith that motivated my dad to never let anyone make him ashamed of being a Jew. But for my dad, who was only in elementary school, it was abundantly clear that he was different from other kids. While he could normally go anywhere with his friends, when it came to the Rivy, he could only go as far as the parking lot. With respect to members and guests, the unspoken rule was loud and clear. No blacks, no Jews. The Riviera Club has been a Northside institution since its founding on January 12, 1933. On June 9th, following repairs from a flood, the first pool made its debut on the property, starting the Riviera's reputation as a swimming destination. Yet, the club wasn't just a place for a select few to relax and socialize. The Riviera was still a private institution, one that ensured club members would only be surrounded by residents of the community that they actively wanted to engage with. For some Hoosiers, like my Jewish father, membership was firmly denied. When the Riviera Club first opened its doors in 1933, negative views towards non-whites and Jews were not uncommon. During the 1920s and 30s, the widespread belief that black swimmers would dirty the water, compounded with anxieties accelerated by the gender integration of American pools at the time. The increased physical intimacy between sexes fueled the notion that white women needed to be protected from black men. For Jews, widely held anti-Semitic beliefs served to alienate and restrict access to broader society. The notion that Jews were a separate race threatening white Americans became prominent as an influx of Eastern European Jews immigrated to the United States at the turn of the 20th century. Establishments like the Broadmoor and the Westchester country clubs were formed to give Jewish Hoosiers their own spaces cloistered away from a hateful public. However, by the late 60s, open discrimination against Jews in these areas, as well as in social spaces like clubs and resorts, was on a downward trend as fair-skinned Jews were enveloped by the construct of whiteness. As the civil rights movement gained steam, many private clubs across the country ended their most flagrantly racist membership policies. By 1960, executive director of the Indianapolis Jewish Community Center, Harold Robbins, assured that membership was open to people of any race or creed, reversing its previous policy of being a space exclusive to only Jewish people. This was before Labor Secretary Arthur Goldberg urged private Jewish clubs across the country to begin admitting applicants irrespective of religion or race in 1961, a move that sparked rigorous discussions, even in Indiana. Outside of the Jewish community, by 1967, the YMCA made a national directive that all local branches were required to not discriminate based on race when it came to membership, a sentiment reinforced by a 1970s civil rights case won against a branch in Alabama that had continued segregating. Racial integration becoming normalized at private clubs across the country made the Riviera Club, with its anti-integration membership committee, stand out for its staunch refusal to change its policies. In response to the Riviera Club's continued anti-integration policies, in 1972, an initiative was founded within the Indianapolis branch of the National Urban League, an organization that promotes equality and provides services for African Americans and other disadvantaged people. This Indianapolis Urban League subgroup named themselves the Riviera Club Task Force and made integrating the Riviera Club their mission. To accomplish this, the task force encouraged, among other things, Black community members to apply for membership and white Rivi members to sponsor Black applicants, knowing that they would be rejected. The plan from there was to engage the Riviera Club in a lawsuit, alleging illegal racial discrimination. As the years went on, the Riviera Task Force would eventually expand to include individuals within the wider Indianapolis community, including Ernie and Sue Kobets.
When we moved into the neighborhood, we had heard about the Riviera Club and heard that there was some discrimination going on.
Our oldest son had started swimming lessons at the Y on Guyan Road prior to that time. And then when we had the opportunity of putting our application in with the support of other people, we kind of changed our minds, thinking that, the time is right now that this may change for the neighborhood. It really had, I think, taken on another level of importance and dedication when one of the individuals that was on the task force, young son, had tried to go to the Riviera Club and swim one afternoon. What they did back then, they put a sign up and said that, sorry, but we're full capacity. So the kids left and just walked across the parking lot, went to the river, and went swimming. Well, he wasn't a very good swimmer, he drowned. So that really added impetus to the dedication of a lot of people to say it's time that this needs to change.
And the catalyst for change would come in 1974, when Robert Bates and Michael Woodard sued the Riviera Club on the basis of illegal racial discrimination. Robert Bates, an early member of the Riviera Club Task Force and a member of the club, was permitted by club staff to bring 2 white guests during the summer of 1974. However, during the same summer, he was disallowed from bringing Woodard as a guest despite him meeting the same criteria as Bates' previous guests, save for the fact that he was Black. Woodard and Bates were not in for an easy legal battle. The accusation levied at the club was that they violated Title II of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which guarantees equal access to public accommodations to everyone, regardless of race. However, the Riviera Club labeled themselves as a private club, which exempted them from the protections against racial discrimination offered by the Civil Rights Act. My father disagreed with the Riviera Club's assessment. No longer the helpless young child barred from the club, my dad was now a lawyer capable of challenging the Riviera's discriminatory policies. Operating on a shoestring budget, my dad and a handful of dedicated individuals had to pull out all the stops to have a shot at winning this case.
My connection with the Riviera case came through Larry Reuben. Told me that he was supposed to go to trial on this case. I knew about the case because it was quite visible, that it was set in like 3 or 6 months and that he was ill and that would I be willing to help him? And I said, sure. Larry didn't like to be excluded from any place, okay? And to be excluded because he was Jewish. I mean, Larry Reuben was very Jewish. And by that I mean very aware of his background, very aware of his parents' background, his mother having walked out of Russia. He was not going to be put down or excluded or injured because of his religious and ethnic background. That was just not something he could tolerate. It was personal that he was excluded, and he made that clear to me. But it was what was happening to his group and what was happening to another group. We're not going to have more people suffer from this. That was sort of his move. We're not going to have our minority community, which is all over this neighborhood, we're not going to have them insulted and hurt. It was a simple scar on the neighborhood that this huge club would discriminate. And it was a real moral quandary because a lot of the people who belonged, they didn't believe in discrimination, but they believed in going swimming with their kids. And so they were conflicted, and the neighborhood was conflicted. So to me, it was very important to send a message that we can live together and that we're not going to put up with what we thought was blatant discrimination.
That was part of the problem, is that there were a lot of people that belonged to the Riviera Club that didn't believe in the policy, but it was convenient for them to belong there, and therefore they didn't do anything about it.
there weren't a lot of these cases, and the issue was there was an exception for a private club. So if you had 10 friends or neighbors who wanted to have a club, or you had a club of your relatives, the law made provision for a private organization. So the question was the Riviera Club, quote, private? And the law had evolved to say that, if it was expensive, if it was exclusive by relatives, if it had a modest number of people, like a country club, for example, that was kind of a gray area, it would be allowed to continue as a private club. We said the Riviera Club, as I recall, there were 10,000 people eligible to go swimming at the Riviera Club. We said that's not anybody's definition of privacy. So we thought we had a good claim, but that's the basic legal issue.
After cycling through a number of judges who either refused to hear the case outright or recused themselves, the lawsuit eventually ended up in the hands of Judge Gene Brooks. But finding the judge wasn't the only issue with litigating the case.
Larry and I tried to do the ordinary things, and we tried to do it on the cheap because we didn't have any money. This shows how bad off we were financially. We had enough money to take one deposition.
So they picked the chairman of the Rivi's membership committee and moved forward with the deposition.
He said, as long as I'm on the membership committee, there never will be a black member. So he basically admitted that if a black person got the requisite vote, he would personally blackball them. So no black person could be admitted.
That single deposition would be crucial to arguing their case before the judge and the Rivi's lawyer. The club's legal defense, headed by Hoosier Republican bigwig Don Tabbert, was largely that all multiracial individuals trying to integrate the club were doing so for illegitimate reasons. A key aspect of their defense was couched in propping up the freedom of association within private spaces. Tabbert argued that, by virtue of being a private club, the Rivi was an extension from the home to a place of social relaxation and recreation, and that he should have the right to not want to associate with one who would willingly engage in forcing him to integrate. You cannot be forced to associate with people who say you must, admit certain people. In addition to characterizing people like Mike Rodman as infringing on the members' rights, Tabbert described their actions in a hostile manner. Throughout his statements in court and to the press, Tabbert described applicant families of color as invaders and infiltrators, solely applying as a form of activism. He even went so far as to tell reporters the plaintiffs have put a gun to the Riviera's head since 1975. To counter this line of reasoning, my father and Ed DeLaney were just as particular with their choice of witness as they had been with who to take their only deposition from.
Gil Holmes was the first person to testify. Gil was a major in the Army, served in Vietnam, had one biracial child, and an adopted son that was Korean and white.
Gil was a very interesting person with a lot of principles. He had a sense of adventure. He loved people. In the beginning, we were told, there's this neighborhood swim club that you can join, and I just thought it was going to be perfect. After we applied, we were invited to come and talk to them. Then, as I recall, it wasn't very long after, maybe a week, maybe two, we received a letter denying our application. We heard, I think in my mind, it was a developing discrimination case against the club because they denied membership to African Americans. Gil was asked to testify. He did appear in his military uniform at the trial. So it was apparent that as a military officer, he was just trying to live his life with his family.
He was the first witness. He testified in his uniform with all these awards and medals. He'd been in Vietnam. He was a wonderful human and a wonderful soldier. That made a pretty strong impression, and he made it clear that he wouldn't be allowed to belong to the Riviera Club. He had been turned away, so that was a great start.
Clearly, we're an interracial family, and my husband is African American. My children are biracial. I believe that is why we were denied.
It was an interesting day, but I think that after Gil and I testified, shortly after that, I think that the wheels were set into motion to start looking for a way to settle that, because they had spent an incredible amount of money, and they found that the task force was not, or that the people that applied were not really just people that were just trying to break something up, that they were people that lived in the neighborhood, whose families went to school and owned businesses in the neighborhood, and merely wanted their kids to swim at the Riviera Club.
In the days that followed, several members of the community were called to the witness stand to testify about their experiences with racism at the Rivy. One witness claimed that he was rejected by the club despite securing a sponsorship from a member whose endorsement had helped a similar white applicant become a member. Another alleged that his ultimately rejected application was inspired by the death of Dwight Jones, and a desire to directly challenge the policies that he claimed still posed a threat to kids like Dwight. With powerful testimony displaying a clear pattern from the Riviera, the first week and a half of court made the plaintiffs look less like underdogs with each passing day.
So I think that once they realized that the public opinion was going to be against them, that it was going to be difficult for them to continue to raise money and continue in good conscience to really fight this.
There's a provision in the law that says that if you're the defendant in a lawsuit and you think the other side just has not done the job, you can ask the court to what they call a direct verdict. The judge says, Mr. Defendant, you don't need to call any witnesses because this case is so weak that it could never win. So they made this motion saying that we had absolutely no basis to go forward, that they didn't need to call any witnesses or put on any defense. That was their argument. The next morning, never forget this, sat up there on the bench. He had like a 2 or 3 page type statement in his hand. So normally judges would just deny these motions because they're just automatic. They're easy. Instead, he read his response. He said, I'm going to read to you, and I don't know if you can find this in the record. I'm going to read to you what I would have to rule if I ruled now. He proceeded to just hit them over the head. I find out you discriminated based on race. You did it repeatedly. You're too large a club to be a private club under the law. This has gone on for years. But based on the evidence that Reuben and DeLaney have presented here, you're going to lose big time.
The judge called the representatives from the Riviera Club to the bench and said they needed to settle this case. And if they did not settle this case, the plaintiffs would own the club.
At which point, we did what always happens, which is we made a deal.
After a long legal battle and tough negotiations, the two parties made a deal. As part of this deal, the club would retain its private status. In return, the Riviera's membership and leadership positions, some of which were to be appointed by Ed DeLaney and my father, would be open to all races and ethnicities. Additionally, the club agreed to pay an estimated $75,000 in legal fees.
That was important to us, not just for the finances. We had put in far more time than $75,000. We just wanted to make the point that you can't do this without having to pay someone. You can't just change your rules, make no payment, and quietly slink away.
As a result of that settlement, we were invited to join, and Gil was invited to be a member of the board of directors. The traditional board members had complained about their lack of money. So Gil's response to that comment was, well, bad decisions cost money.
I don't think even the first time we went after the court case that we felt like it was going to be safe and welcoming. The people who managed it were just dastardly negative people. My daughter, that's older and white, a year older, would forget her little pin. You wore a pin on your suit, and she'd forget her pin, and they'd just say, oh, go ahead. Every time Kristen, my daughter who's black, would go and forget her pin, they would hassle her until she'd go up to the office, and some kind person would finally say, let this child in.
However, change did come. And as the years went on, the Riviera Club distanced itself from its troubled past, going so far as to apologize for the harm caused by the exclusionary Riviera policies of the past. In 2012, the Riviera Club's manager, Brian Avery, wrote in the club's newsletter that he had recently met with Gil Holmes and thanked him. not just because sharing his story was uncomfortable, but more because by his efforts, he helped transform the Rivy from a place my family would not have considered joining to the wonderful, inclusive community it is today.
I came as a guest as a child. We couldn't join Rivy. My father's Jewish, so as you know, that wouldn't happen back when I was young. When I was in 8th grade, our 8th grade party was going to be here at Rivy. And a mother of one of my classmates asked my mother when I was standing there, said, well, why aren't you guys members at Rivy? And my mother said, because Jack is Jewish. And they said, well, just don't put it on there. She was on the board. So we did join Rivy for a little while. As an adult, when we bought our house across the canal, and I just thought, why would I get in my car and drive someplace else when I could walk over here?
What I know about the history of the club is basically what people say or what was written in the article about your father. Not originally being from Indianapolis, my history and what I learned comes from people and from being here at the club. You know, from the time of the article from your father, I mean, there's no longer a committee sitting there saying, let us look at you before we allow you in and let us check and see whatever. I mean, that doesn't exist. So I think that's the change. This club not being like that, being very open, as I said, one of the most open that I've experienced in my career in this business, you know, that means that it's welcoming, and that's what we try to be. It's a community, it's a family, it's welcoming.
But while the Riviera Club has certainly come a long way since Barbara's childhood and the conclusion of the court case, there is notably still work to be done to improve diversity and inclusion at the club's highest levels.
I'm on the membership committee, and we meet once a month also. And that committee, we talk about, you know, the number of new members, the number of members that have left. Currently, we are not diverse at all on the board. I can't tell you the history of the board because I don't know it accurately as far as diversity. But it is something that we are trying to incorporate because it is all white, and it shouldn't be.
You know, you bring in the people that you want to be associated with. This club has probably the most open membership policy of any club that I've ever been associated with or managed in my career, and that spans over 40 years. You don't have to be recommended by another member here. You don't have to go through the practice of what some clubs do of posting a membership application. A lot of people think, oh, that's just to get other people to know you in the club, but that's also a way to get people to come up and say, we'd rather not have that person as a member of our club. This club doesn't do that.
Rivy always touted itself as a family place. But everything we do on the board always has had in the back of our minds family, inclusion, no exclusion. You know, our history is there. And for many years, I didn't tell people I was a member here because I knew they knew the history and they would think that this was a horrible place. But it's not a horrible place. And I do tell people I'm a member at Rivy now.
Themselves are inherently discriminatory. Hebrew clubs discriminate against Gentiles. All women's clubs discriminate against men. Men's clubs discriminate against women. When people form clubs, they're going to form clubs based on who they want to associate with. You know, history is one of those things where people keep repeating it, and sometimes they repeat the parts that they think it was or that they think they know. Sometimes not every part of history is actually printed or told correctly as things get passed on. You know, I wasn't here at the time. I can't tell you. I can tell you what the part of Rivy that I am now and how welcoming and open that is. And the people that I get to work with to be able to do that and to bring members in and to be able to welcome them and have them use our facilities. That's creating a family and a community that I want to be associated and a part of. You can walk into this club. One of our staff members will be happy to give you a tour if you've never been here before. You can fill out a membership application and you can become a member of this club on the spot.
The fallout of the case didn't just stay confined to the Rivi. It rippled out into the surrounding city and was important in setting social standards for racial and ethnic inclusion.
So yeah, I think it was very heartening for the neighborhood, heartening for the people that were involved. There was a lot of satisfaction in getting it resolved.
But the integration of the Riviera does not mark the end of bigotry. Racism and anti-Semitism still thrive today, though they may manifest differently than they did 40 years ago. But no matter how they end up manifesting, the course of action to respond has not changed.
I just think that in today's climate, even the climate of 40 years ago, when you heard something, you had an opportunity of either saying something or remaining quiet. It's incumbent on everybody to speak up.
It's important that we know our history in relation to how we live today. I think it's important to see contrast, the change, that people had to do something to make change. History helps us move forward and helps us be better.
In Judaism, we have a concept known as tikkun olam, or repair the world. This is commonly understood as an obligation for Jews to not only better their own communities, but society at large as well. But while my father worked to fulfill a religious obligation in fighting the Rivi's bigoted membership policies, he couldn't have done it alone. Families like the Holmeses and the Kobetses, as well as community groups, faith organizations, and other lawyers like DeLaney, made it well known that racism would not be tolerated in the Butler-Tarkington neighborhood, and in doing so, worked together to repair one small corner of the world. What was true then is true now. As injustices like police brutality, anti-Semitic attacks, and other forms of prejudice and bigotry continue, it requires finding ways both as individuals as well as communities to repair the world. For my dad, that meant working through the legal system.
There are a lot of reasons to be a lawyer, and Larry exemplified two of them. First of all, he had a personality that fitted. So trial lawyer, he liked the combat, he liked the disagreement, he liked the arguments. Okay, that's one of the reasons. You can make a lot of money, some people do. The third reason is that you think you can make a difference somewhere, either in individual lives or in society. He was in the camp that was willing to help individuals, but really wanted to change society. There were things that angered him, that offended him, and racism was at the top of the list. And I admired him for it. I loved him for it.
In the summers that followed the settlement, my father would walk along the canal with an earshot of the Rivi's pool and know that the lawsuit made a tangible difference in his neighborhood. The Riviera case remained the most fulfilling of his career, despite going on to more prominent cases in higher courts. In taking on the Riviera, my father resolved the hurt of a young boy that was told that his Jewishness made him incompatible with white, Gentile society. In response, and with the help of his community, my dad wrested power from the establishment to help heal Indianapolis.